Hi, Angel. Welcome to the show.
Hey Josh, how's it going?
I appreciate you coming on, man.
Thank you, and I appreciate you having me on as well.
Of course. So let's talk death. Um, what about death affected you personally? And it affected you personally in such a way that led you to work with people who are grieving as a result of a death in the family or a death of someone close to them.
Yeah, so throughout my life, I would say my first major encounter with death was the death of my grandfather, right? And that did affect me, but I think it was a lot easier for me to process his death because he was already up there in age when it happened, and also, his health wasn't doing too well, before he passed away. So it was easier for me to accept that. However, later on, I had some more tragic encounters. I actually had first two cousins that died. One was murdered, and another one died because of health complications. And those affected me as well. But I was close to those cousins, but not as much as then. What happened later on is that I lost another cousin to suicide, and that death really hit me hard because that cousin in particular, I was very close to him, and he was like a brother figure to me, and that's kind of like the first time that I really struggled with grief. Because prior to that, it did affect me, but I was able to get through it. But his loss like really threw me in a spiral that I wasn't prepared for, and it took me about a year to actually like for my to come to the self-realization that it was having a negative impact on my life, like how I was coping with it. And that kind of led me down the path of what I'm doing right now, is helping others deal with these kinds of situations.
So, with each subsequent death in your life after your grandfather, was your view on death and how we handle it changed and altered?
Yeah, I would say like it really made me think a lot about how there's no there's no linear path to how life works in general, right? Because with my grandfather's death, I guess it was kind of like, the more cookie cutter explanation that we have to death, where, you reach a certain point in your life and then you transition on to the next, right? Because of old age or illness. But with the first cousin that died, he was murdered, right? And he was pretty young when he died. He was in his 20s. And then my other cousin, they were in their late 30s, and they were actually just about to start a family when this tragically happened, right? And then we shift on to my other cousin, the one that was like a brother figure to me. He died by suicide, right? And that's something that I didn't really expect to have to deal with, right? And then it just threw me in for a loop. Like I was questioning, like wow, what's what do I expect out of life? What am I supposed to do now? Like, and all these questions, right? And then like why, right? Why did all these tragic things happen? Um, and then it led me down to just reanalyzing like my views on life, death, and just everything, my worldview in general, right? Because I really didn't think about death as much prior to that. I just, I knew something, it was something that was there, but it's kind of like, all right, it's not something I should worry about yet, right? But I guess all these events kind of put me in a state of like paranoia to some extent, and that I was like more aware of it. And then not in a healthy way, initially, right? I didn't have a good relationship with thinking about death at first, though. It was very nerve wracking, to think about it.
So, what would you say was unhealthy about the way that you were thinking about death at that time?
Yeah, so with the death of my cousin that died by suicide, I was just, really just disappointed in life in general, right? Like I was like, well, what's the point of all this, right? Like that these kind of things happen and there's no, comfort in the situation, right? And just um questioning my own beliefs too, right? Because with suicide, like I had these and I still battle with it too, right? Like because of my religious upbringing, the which is primarily based off Christianity, right? To die that way is considered a sin, right? And there are these alleged consequences from going about this, right? So it was that just put me in more despair, right? Like thinking about like, wow, like this person could potentially be suffering more after if there is some sort of afterlife and these consequences. And now I would say, my religious beliefs have changed a bit. I would say now I don't subscribe to any particular religion, but I'm more open minded, right, about what happens. And I'm still, I haven't come up with a concrete theory of what happens in particular. But I think now I'm less obsessed with the outcome, right? I've learned to focus more on what I do have control over, right? And when it comes to death, like even my own mortality, right? I truly don't know when I'm gonna die, right? But I can just control like how I live my life while I am living, right? Because when it's my turn, right? But I just don't know when that's gonna happen. And I think I became a little obsessed with that potential when I was going through this, and also like just questioning, death and the consequences behind it. And now I've learned to step back a little bit and just appreciate life more, and also appreciate death too, in a way that is it's not much, it's less fearful of a thing to worry about, and just accept it as a normal part of life, right? And not just death but loss in general, right? Like we will encounter all types of losses in our life, not just death, right? Like the change of relationships, the change of environments, change of maybe even careers in some cases, right? These are all our loss of identity as we transition into other, um, a- um, milestones in our life, right? Sometimes for some people, they transition to becoming a parent, right? Or a caretaker, or all these things, right? And when we transition into some of these things, we do lose a bit of our former self, right? And this is all okay, because again, it's part of life, right? And I think I've learned not to be as frightened by these changes, and to accept these losses and appreciate them as just part of the human experience.
Yeah, yeah. Life is change. And I mean, in the springtime, you know, plants begin their fruition. The summertime, they bloom. The fall, they begin to um, deteriorate. In the winter, they
Right.
die. This happens every year. This is the cycle of life. But it seems that when it's applied to humanity and when it's applied to people that you care about, there is a strong emotional aspect to it. And which brings me to your project, GriefX. And it seems that you were inspired enough by the death around you to start a program where you can help other people to get through the trauma that death brings them. So, can you talk a little bit about how you started GriefX and what exactly it is?
Yeah. So when um when I was going through the loss of my cousin, the one that was like a brother figure to me, it was the first time that I sought out therapy, right? So about the 1 year mark, I realized that I wasn't coping with it too well. Like I was really depressed, and I was trying to hide that fact from other people and for myself as well, right? Like I was just trying to block that out. And I wasn't really doing too well in general. Like I was barely keeping it together emotionally, and I just I wasn't in a good place. So I decided to get some help. And I've had always heard of therapy, right? But I never really looked into it, because I had dealt with depression before, but not to a point where I wasn't able to manage it on my own. So I went to a therapist, and one of the things that she recommended was a support group, right? She said, something you should look into. And I was familiar with the concept, because I've heard about things like AA and stuff like that, right? But I thought like those support groups were mainly for like like substance problems and stuff like that. I didn't really think that that kind of thing existed for these kinds of issues. So while looking for one, I had a hard time finding a support group that fit my schedule. So I kept looking and looking, and eventually I found this company that they did training sessions to host, like, facilitate support groups in like a medical setting. So it was for like hospitals, hospice, and those kinds of environments. So I ended up taking that course, even though it wasn't really meant for like regular people. But I'm a very hands-on person, right? I wanted to like learn more about what I was going through. So I took that course, and then it was very it was an eye opening experience because I learned that a lot of people that were working with others dealing with this kind of thing, they were not well prepared to handle it, right? And it made me realize that even like in the professional world, like there's still a lot to be learned about this, right? And that there's a need to further the work that goes into this. So I did some other, I read some more books, I did some more training, and then eventually I decided to give it a try and start my own support group. And that's kind of how GriefX got started. Um, and it's been an interesting journey because I've learned a lot also from just our participants. Like people share their stories, what works for them, what doesn't, and I'm always learning more from others. And the thing I like to promote is that like I'm not a grief expert at other people's grief, right? We can only be grief experts at our own grief. So what I try to help people is become a grief expert at their own grief, right? Um, because at the end of the day, only you know what works for you, what doesn't, what's effective, what's not, and you kind of have to learn also to adapt to the situation that you're in, right? Because our needs change as time goes on. So I really promote that philosophy to the people that attend our groups. And then I also really encourage people to talk about it, right? Because while there are things that, might not help everyone, I've yet to encounter someone that has told me that talking about it, hasn't helped them. So I'm very confident in saying that if like, if you're really stuck and you don't know what to do, just talk to someone about it, right? It doesn't have to be a professional, just anyone willing to listen. That helps. It's not gonna make the grief go away necessarily, but it will, it'll help you get one step closer to coping with it better.
So, is your work mainly concerned with people who are grieving post the death of a loved one, or do you also deal with people who are um, like spending time with a dying person or helping someone to transition from life to death?
Yeah, so it's primarily the aftermath, and in some cases too, even though I would say like probably like 60% of our participants are dealing with losses related to death, but then we have another, you know 40 or so that are also dealing with other losses. So man, it might not be death, it could be breakups, divorces, so things of that nature as well, because even though those losses are not associated with death, in a way it is a death of something else, right? When you're going through a breakup or a divorce, it's a death of a relationship, right? And in many other cases too, if you really think about it, it's a death of an identity, right? Because prior to this relationship ending, you identified yourself as part of this relationship, right? So you held a different role, and now this has been taken away from you, and now you have to kind of start fresh in your new identity, right? So I think in those cases, it's not just the death of a relationship when it comes to divorce or breakup, but it's also a death of your prior identity, right?
Yeah, I love that because I think a lot of people, when they look at the aftermath of death, they want to look at things in a way where they get things back to what they were when things were normal. And
Right.
I think a better way to look at it is to feel yourself within the new person that emerges from the experience of having someone die that's close to you.
Right.
So, do you do at all any kind of work with people who are in the process of dying or people who are dealing with someone who is in the process of dying?
No, that's not really what we deal with at the moment.
So, what do you feel is like some of the most common themes that you notice that people come to you with? Like some of the most common problems that they see manifesting in their lives without the person that they've just lost?
Yeah, so a lot of times, just people are not comfortable talking about it, right? And they feel kind of lost. And I think for a lot of people, they kind of had the same problem that I had initially, was just opening up about it, right? Because again, like this is something that I feel like as a society, like we're not really well equipped to deal with, especially in Western societies, right? Um, so like again, like we're familiar with like getting help for like substance abuse and health issues, right? But when it comes to mental health, I think we're still lagging behind a bit, right? And then also to some extent, like we've come a long way now in promoting, positive mental health advice and things of that nature. But it's easier said than done, right? Even with things like, like for example, like all these hotlines that exist, right? The suicide hotline and whatever. These things don't necessarily um provide ongoing support. It's kind of just like it's just a stepping stone, right? There's still a lot more work that goes into it. So I think a lot of people, they're just lost in how to deal with it in general, right? And even like, with like the advice the therapist gave me, she was like, oh, like find a support group, right? But it wasn't easy, right? Like I did find some, but a lot of them didn't, meet my schedule. And then also there's also these financial constraints that exist, right? A lot of mental health resources do cost money, right? Um, and in my case, like I was fortunate enough that I was able to afford the therapist and to do all these other things, but not everyone is that fortunate, right? And also when you're dealing with some of these losses, you might also be dealing with, financial hardships as a result of them, right? Say if it's if your spouse just died, you might, have to deal with the financial costs associated with that, right? Because not everyone has money set aside to handle these affairs, right? So there's these other logistical issues that people don't consider, right? When they give, blanket advice like, oh, I get help, right? Okay, but help generally costs money, right? And you're dealing with all these things on top of that, right? And then in some cases, there's other barriers, right? So to give you a real example, like, you know, the, I don't really consult with my therapist too often, but occasionally when I want in the past when I've had to make an appointment with her, it's not easy, right? Because she's often booked already, right? So I might have to wait. So it's not even that I can't afford her session, right? It's like I'm willing to pay her fee, but she's just not available, right? So all these things exist, and I was also fortunate that I got pretty lucky in that my first consultation was good, right? Some people they try therapy out and they have a bad experience, right? Because they get someone that's not a good match, right? And this can be, very disheartening, especially let's say you're struggling financially, right? So, you put all this money aside to pay for the session and it doesn't help you. You feel even worse now, right? Because now, you have this financial loss and then also the help that you got is not really helpful, right? And it's not easy getting help, and I think a lot of people, they're just clueless of how to go about it, right? But again, I think talking about it is a good way to get the process started, right? Because that kind of opens the door for you to start thinking getting into the mindset that this is something that can be resolved, right? And again, it's not an easy process, but I think talking about it is the first step to getting there.
You mentioned that in the Western world here, we don't really associate death in the correct way. And we don't really have a society with a foundation that supports people who are going through this type of grieving process. So, why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with just the fact that it's still a discomforting thought for a lot of people, right? And we're also just conditioned to not deal with hardships, right? I think like this whole like COVID situation was a big wake up call to the realities of death and loss, right? Because even if you were fortunate enough not to lose anyone to COVID, you for sure lost something, right? Even if you didn't lose your job or your career or anything like that, like you did lose your freedom to some extent, right? No matter where in the world. So it was like a global thing where everyone felt some sort of loss, right? Because for sure COVID had prevented you at some point from doing something that you enjoyed, right? um so I think but again, people forget that that there are other people less fortunate than us that deal with these kinds of struggles all the time. I mean, there's people that where they live at, like they don't have enough like their supply chain isn't as good as ours, right? So, for example, countries like Venezuela, they struggle with supply chain issues. So even though people have money to buy stuff from the supermarket, there's not enough supplies there, right? And then other people in countries where they're hit by tropical storms and things of that nature, or even right now, what's going on with the Ukrainian and Russia situation, right? With the war, right? There's people experiencing death all the time, all kinds of other losses associated with that. Um, so that's just the way the world works. But I mean, I think particularly in like the United States, we're very fortunate that we don't deal with a lot of these issues, right? Even right now, like let's say hypothetically, we were to get more hands-on involved in the war, right? It's highly unlikely that we would see combat on our soil, right? I mean, of course, maybe people that are in the military would for sure see combat, but that's abroad. Like it's very rare that we see warfare on our actual soil, right? Historically speaking, that hasn't happened for a very long time. So again, we would be even then we would be shielded from that fact, right? But people in other countries, they're not so fortunate about this, right? They actually see buildings getting torn down, and they see all kinds of bloodshed firsthand, which we're shielded from here in the West. And I even and actually was actually doing some research, just to refresh myself before we came on this call. And I typed in just for the hell of it, I typed in like the human life cycle on Google Images, right? And it was kind of interesting. So I saw a lot of pictures that didn't show death, right? I guess it was meant for children, but a lot of them omitted death. So it was like it showed the fetus, and then being a child, being a teenager, and then just elderly person, and then ended right there, right? But it's like no, there's another step that you're missing, right? So it's interesting how like we just kind of try to put it, out of sight, out of mind, but it doesn't work that way, right? It's something that's part of life, and I think some other cultures do a better job at integrating that, and even just that conversation, like I'm fortunate enough that my parents, they're both still alive, but they have talked to myself, and I have a sibling about how to handle their death, right? Like as far as like some logistical stuff. So we've had that conversation, and also I've talked to my parents about what if I die, and my sister has also talked to us about what happens if she dies. So we do have some sort of plan, and of course it's gonna hurt when it happens, but at least like we've had this conversation, right? But a lot of people don't have this conversation in their households, right? And even right now with the person I'm dating, like we've discussed this as well, like because we don't have a family yet, but that is a goal of ours. And when we get to that stage, we will definitely be having conversations about this, right? Because it's something that you have to be prepared for, right? Because it is going to happen at some point.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up the pictures that you saw on Google, because it really does seem like we just ignore death. We just are so scared to think of it because it means the loss of either someone that we care about in the physical form or the loss of our own ego and who we think that we are in terms of our own death. And it seems to me like it's a spiritual problem, which is why, like you said, I think a lot of other countries, a lot of other cultures handle it in a more adult and responsible way because they seem to revolve their spiritual beliefs around um, the process of dying and then what happens after death. So, has this experience working with people who are grieving and the experience of having people close to you die, does that change your beliefs spiritually? And does it change what you feel like happens after you die?
Yeah, it has. I think now I'm a bit more open minded about the possibilities of how the afterlife looks like if there is one, right? I think I've always believed in an afterlife, but I think before I had a more um I had settled more on a particular idea, right? But now I think I keep more of an open mind. But again, like I still haven't decided on like a particular, outcome that I feel much confidence in. But overall though, I think what has changed the most is just that I'm not as obsessed about, what that looks like, right? I think I've just come to realize that, while I may have some theories that seem very plausible to me, like at the end of the day, I won't know until it happens, right? So whether there is no afterlife and we just die and it all ends there, or whether there is some sort of other realm that we enter, or maybe we reincarnate. I don't know, right? And I think it's okay that I don't know, right? I think before I was more obsessed with, like, I have to know the answer. And I think now I'm getting to a point where I'm not as concerned about what the answer is. I just accept that I truly won't know until it's my time, right? And that's not to say that I'm still not curious about it. I am curious about it. I'm still, again, I keep an open mind, right? So, if I come across material that suggests otherwise what I believe in, or supports what I'm currently trying to lean towards, I will indulge in those thoughts, right? But I'm not as obsessed as I was before, and, like, having to know what happens, because I think at the end of the day, like, we have to focus over things that we do have control over, right? And I don't have control over what happens in the afterlife, right? But to some extent, right? I just have control over my own life, right? And I just try to focus on that these days, on what I can do while I'm still alive, right? That doesn't mean that I don't, respect possibilities that may occur, right? But I feel like it's not healthy to dwell on that too much, because then you become obsessed with something that you truly have very little control over, right? And instead, it's better to focus on that energy on things that we do have control over. And I think also I've learned to be more respectful towards other people's beliefs about those things, because I think it's very easy to become biased, right? And I think that's also something that's very unfortunate in today's society, is that people, especially now, like, it seems that everyone's on an extreme level, right? And I think we should try to be more open minded, because yes, maybe in some cases some people are wrong, right? But again, like, we cannot, we should still give other people a chance to to have a discussion about it, right? And everyone is entitled to their opinion, and I think right now, everyone's kind of like on the edge, and that causes a lot of conflict, right? Because it creates a divide, right? And when it comes to especially issues like the afterlife, right? It's very tricky, because no matter what you believe in, like, truly the proof lies in in getting there, right? Like, that's the only way we'll know for sure.
Yeah, it seems to me that whether or not it's right or whether or not someone else is right or wrong about it doesn't really matter. I think just a deeper understanding of death will benefit us in any way, shape, or form, even if our ideas about it might not match other people's or might not match other ideologies. But do you find that in your work, relating death to spirituality helps people, or do you find that it's not really an integral part?
Right. So, Um, I try to keep a secular view in general in how I run my organization. However, what I do is I do like themed discussion topics during certain sessions, right? And one of those topics is spirituality, right? And in these sessions, we kind of touch upon more like spirituality. However, in the general meetings, I don't really push any belief systems. However, I always encourage people, even in the meetings that don't revolve around spirituality, to bring it up if it's relevant to the discussion, and if they find that it helps, right? So if someone wants to share that, praying helps them, or things of that nature, then they're allowed to talk about it. But I don't revolve uh the topic around spirituality, or I don't push any ideas revolving around that in the general meetings, because I think that it's tricky to do that effectively, right? Because then again, because there's this big divide, like you said, that people have their own notions, and when we start to push certain ideas, it may make other people feel alienated from it, right? And grief is already a complex thing to deal with. We don't need to complicate it even more. And I think it's better just to focus on the common ground than on the differences, right? Because again, at the end of the day, I mean, I can't, I can't say that what I believe in is correct, right? Because it's very difficult to prove that. So to spend time, making someone else feel bad that they believe differently is not beneficial. So instead, when we do talk about spirituality, I just, I do share my some of my beliefs, and I let other people share their beliefs, but we kind of try to avoid trying to push the idea that anyone in particular is right or wrong, right? It's more or less like, okay, we give them a platform to express, what is working for them, and in some cases, if they can also talk about how spirituality might also be an obstacle for them, right? And just creating a safe space to talk about this relationship between the loss and spirituality.
Yeah, that's a good point. I could definitely see the spiritual aspect of understanding death being an issue for people. Um, because if you don't have a grasp on what it is you think happens when you die or while someone is dying, and you don't have like an understanding of how that's going to affect you and how you can take steps to alleviate that grief, I definitely feel like it could be an issue. But do you have any help with this, or do you do this all on your own?
Yeah, so at one point I did have a another member that was helping me run meetings. However, their life circumstances changed a bit and they got busy. So right now I'm running the meetings on my own. However, we do certain meetings that people that have attended the group a few times, they kind of have a gist of how it works. So we have what we call like self-moderated meetings, and these meetings are just run without a formal moderator. So people that have attended the group of a couple times, they can attend these meetings, and they kind of run themselves, right? And it's those meetings are self-sustainable, and then we have the other meetings that are led by myself. Yeah.
And are these in person? Are they online or both?
Right now they're all online. So the way the group got started, actually, we're based out of New York City, so we were doing meetings in person. But then when the pandemic started, um, I transitioned to online, and it's been an interesting transition, because when I went online initially, I was just again only promoting it locally, right? But now I promoted, to other people as well, and we have participants from all over the country, and sometimes even from abroad. Like we've had people from Europe or and Canada joining us as well. So it's always interesting to see how people from other countries deal with it, and what unique challenges they have. So yeah, so as of right now, it's online based, and we do plan on resuming the in person meetings, but that won't shift away the focus from the online, because I think opening up the platform to everyone is very helpful. So we'll continue to offer support online, but at some point we will revisit doing in person meetings when it makes logistical sense to do so. But it'll be a supplemental thing; like it won't replace the online meetings.
Yeah, it's amazing to be able to open it up to the world, and to experience, like you said, the differences between how other cultures from different places handle grief uh, from death. Are there any noticeable differences that you can think of between different cultures and how they have approached death within your meetings?
Yeah, so I would say primarily I primarily have experience with like our Canadian participants, because that's where most of our foreign participation comes from. And over there, they seem to have resources that we don't have available, right? So actually, what happens is that like in a lot of there's a lot of like statewide programs that are like specific to certain states. So for example, in New York City, they're fortunate enough that they do have um helplines to help with like mental health issues, right? But in some other cities they don't have that kind of thing. Whereas Canada, though, they have like it's just like a federal program where it's a call line that any Canadian can call, and they actually have like this system where you can set up everyone is entitled to an appointment with a counselor. And there is a restriction, like I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe you can only make one appointment for every so often, right? But at least I mean it's something, and it's totally free, right? And it's pretty helpful also, right? Which is another important thing, because sometimes people have good intentions when they make resources, right? But they're not always helpful, right? Because a lot of a lot of these resources, like, they were not made with certain things in mind. It's just a general help, and I think people dealing with grief sometimes need like particular attention, right? And a lot of like the general resources that exist out there may not be a good fit. But from what the Canadian participants have mentioned, like the stuff they have available over there is pretty helpful. So yeah, and then also there's other groups too. A lot of people, they ask like, how do I find, like, if they want to find an in-person group, how do I find one? You can contact like your local funeral homes, right? They often have some resources. Also, hospitals also can be helpful. And then if you lost someone that was in hospice care, you can also contact that hospice, and they can maybe give you a referral. So, but also it's a lot of legwork, right? To get this type of help. It's not easily accessible. Like, you have to dig in, and then again, not every resource is free. Like, even with support groups, like, the help we offer is free. Um, but there's also like paid support groups that you have to commit to a certain series, and you have to pay the fee for that, right? And that could, again, and that also can restrict certain people, right? Because they may not have the funds for it, or even if they can afford it, they can be put off by the fact that they have to commit to this series, right? Because a lot of them are not dropping. So, you pay X amount of dollars, but you have to commit to like whatever, like 4 or 5 sessions. And, people are concerned that, it might not be helpful. So that might put them off from seeking this help. So, these obstacles exist. And again, what I mentioned before also about, the whole therapist hunt, that you might have a hard time finding a therapist in general. And then when you do find one, they might not be a good fit, right? Or if they are a good fit, you might run into the problem that, depending on your situation, you might need ongoing support, and there's schedule might not um, make that feasible. So there's a lot of things that occur that when people recommend get help, they don't really address, right?
Yeah, and I've noticed that, I mean, when I was in school, when I was young, I feel like everybody who is who spends time in a public school is going to have somebody from their class or from their school, someone who they directly coexist with, pass away. Um, and when I was in school, there were some pretty decent programs, that they would have during the school day. If you needed to leave your class and go talk to someone, they would have that available for you. And it seems that that's increasing now with our culture. In schools, they seem to be adhering to um, uh, more protocols to help people to grieve when they have uh, deaths in the family or deaths within their classmates, deaths within their peer group. So, do you see people who are younger, like children, young adults, who are dealing with that kind of thing, or do you only deal with like adult?
Yeah, we primarily deal with adults. So most of our participants are like early 20s to upwards. Yeah, so we don't really deal with children. However, some people that do attend our meetings, they do have children, and they kind of share what their children are going through. But directly, I don't work with children, also because of the nature of what we're doing, right? So especially online, like a child getting them involved would be difficult because of legal concerns. So it's mainly geared towards adults. But yeah, as you mentioned though, that yes, I think there is some improvement as far as raising awareness, and in some cases some school districts are doing a good job, right? And even in the corporate world too, actually some companies do actually have a like bereavement leave, right? So that, which is nice, right? But from my understanding, that's not common. So we still have a long way to go when it comes to that. And I applaud the companies that have that kind of policy, because it's much needed, I feel.
Yeah, usually a lot of those policies don't go far enough, in my opinion, because grief is so personal and the stages of grief are real. And it takes a lot of time to go through that for some people. And each person may get caught on different stages and spend more time there. And it's just such a personalized form of treatment that I feel like you definitely need to, like you said, give people this personal involvement and personal help, really hear their story. Was there anybody in your life who really heard your story and gave you that personal help that you needed when you were dealing with death?
Yeah, I wouldn't say like any particular person, but I would say for sure just getting more comfortable talking about it helped a lot. And I remember like vividly, like when I talked to the therapist about it, like I had a really hard time doing that. Like I was tearing up and breaking down. And then after that, like, I think it just gave me the courage to start talking about it. And then from there, like, I just started talking to other people I knew about it. And then eventually I just got really comfortable in just talking to anyone about it, right? But it was a process. Um, but yeah, I do appreciate a lot, that therapist that I had, that that made me feel safe in sharing my story, and just made me feel that it was normal, right? Um, and but also you have to do the work yourself, right? And again, it's one of those things that it's easier said than done, because it's very painful to talk about your loss, when you're dealing with it, right? And I remember like the first support group meeting that I held, like I was scared that I would start breaking down, while introducing myself, right? Because at that point, like I had made progress, but um, I was still struggling a bit more than I am now. And but yeah, it was good though to be surrounded with other people that can relate to you, right? And I think that sense of community is very helpful. Um, and one advantage that you often get from like these peer-led groups, though, is that you can hear other people's stories and you can relate to them. Whereas most therapists, even if they have lost someone, like they'll kind of refrain from sharing their personal stuff, right? For numerous reasons. And I understand the reasoning behind that, but also I think that limits the experience a bit. I think sometimes it's necessary to hear out the other person's story. And that's one of the advantages of attending groups like what we do, is that you can hear other people's stories, and you can relate to them even if their loss is different, right? And sometimes we get like a mixed bag. Like people have all kinds of losses. Like there's people, maybe someone lost their child, another one lost their spouse, another one is going through a divorce, right? And all these losses, they're different, but they're still all losses, right? And we bond over the fact that we're all going through these losses. And we through grief, like, as even as painful as it is, like, it brings us together, and it makes us appreciate life, and just be more compassionate towards each other, right? That we're all dealing with that. And I think another issue that people struggle with is just comparing their grief, right? Because as you mentioned, grief is an individual experience, right? And a lot of times we try to project, other people's experiences on us, or vice versa. Other people project their experiences on us, right? So sometimes, someone that went through a similar loss will reach out to us, and they may say some hurtful things, right? And it's not with bad intentions, it's just that they dealt with it differently, right? So like a common situation is we get a lot of people that lost a spouse, right? So a lot of people will get suggestions about starting to date again, right? And that can be very hurtful for a lot of people because they're not ready for that, right? And in some cases it's just people have zero interest in that, right? Which is fine, right? Because they have to see what's right for them. And other people, they may have good intentions and they suggest these things. Or some people are very aggressive, right? Like some people have mentioned that someone will actually try to set them up on a date with someone, right? To and again, it's not that the people want them to feel bad, it's just that they think that's going to help, right? But they don't really understand that that person is not at that stage yet, right? So maybe in the future they might be open to dating, or maybe not. Some people, after losing a spouse, they just want to stay single, and that's okay, right? Because again, it's a individual choice and a individual journey.
Yeah, not everyone is the same. Um, how old were you when your cousin died that was very close to you?
Yeah, so it was about 5 years ago. So I was 27, I want to say.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so you did have sort of an adult mindset, a foundational understanding of the world around you. Because yeah, it seems to me that when people die in your life, uh, when you're a lot younger, I think it's really hard and very detrimental to your development and your growth. But one of the most important things, in my view, in terms of how death affects you, is whether or not it's a shock, the age at which the person passes away. Because if like your grandparent passes away and it was a peaceful transition and they were in their 90s and they were slowly declining over time, I feel like it's an easier thing to accept because you can start to understand the life cycle and you can see, okay, this is what happens to everyone. And it gives you some time to work through the grief that it may cause. But when someone dies suddenly, whether it be a car accident or like in your cousin's case, that has to be so much more traumatic. And I'm sure that the people who come to you, I would think that more of them who are having really, really tough times are ones who have been dealing with death that was more sudden or someone younger dying. Do you feel like that's true?
Yeah, I would say, generally speaking, those people would have a harder time. But sometimes too, even people that lose a parent, right? That's at a that's at that stage of life where it's more expected. They're still struggling really hard, right? Because it's a big loss for them, right? And I think again, like a loss is a loss, right? And it, it's like people's relationships to that particular person is so unique that um it's really hard to like imagine what that particular person is going through, right? Like we can always sympathize with them, but it's a very, I feel like when you go through any type of loss, no matter the circumstance, it's like, there's a big puzzle that's there, and like that piece has been removed permanently, right? And no matter what, now it's an incomplete puzzle, right? And nothing can replace that. Um, and yes, in some cases, people say in the loss of a spouse, or a relationship where it's a divorce or breakup, you may date again and remarry and whatnot, right? But again, that's a new puzzle being created, right? It's not the same one. People mistakenly think that new person, is that missing piece that was lost before, and it doesn't work that way, because these these people then create a new experience with the other person, right? So it's a new it's a unique experience. It's not a replacement of the old one. um and in the case of like a parent, or a sibling, that's a very unique connection, right? Because you only have one parent, or one sibling, like that particular parent, that particular sibling. So Yeah, I would say what happens is though that maybe there's a unique challenge, or not unique challenges, but special challenges that you encounter when you're losing someone that's younger, or unexpected stuff. For example, like a parent burying a child, for example, that one kind of throws people in for a loop, right? Because that's not something you expect. You expect your children to bury you, and not the opposite. Um, so when that happens, there's these unique challenges that, or particular challenges that come with it. But yeah, I mean, everyone's hurting, no matter what they're going through.
Yeah, yeah. When someone has to bury their child, that is so terrible because it seems to me that's like throwing off the natural balance of things, so you have to contend with so much heartbreak and so much grief because it just doesn't seem like that should be the way things go linearly, in life. But as we begin to sort of wrap up here a little bit, I wanted to ask you with your work and with everything you've been through and everything you've experienced and taken in, um, where do you think we as a society could improve the most in terms of grief involving death? And what do you see the future being like in terms of the help that people have access to?
Yeah, I think we need to be more open to having this discussion about, death and loss, right? And I think it needs to start at an early age, right? Um, And I think it has to become less of a taboo subject, right? Like at the end of the day, with certainty, I can tell you that, everyone listening to this is gonna die at some point, right? And while that may sound morbid, it's really not. It's just a fact of life, right? Just how we're alive right now, at some point we won't be, right? And that's okay, right? And unfortunately, in some cases, some of us will die tragically, or maybe if we don't die tragically, someone that we love will, or whatever the reason of death may be. Um, and yeah, these things will be unfortunate and it will cause a lot of pain. But again, it's death and loss is part of the life cycle, right? And these are things that we have to be more comfortable in discussing. And it just, I think just having an open mind about being able to talk about it helps, because again, when we go through the motions of when it finally happens to us and we're put in this situation where we need to face it, just if everyone was on the same page, I think it would be a lot easier to deal with it, right? Because you could just talk to anyone about it, right? But right now, because it's such a taboo subject, or not even taboo, it's just a discomforting subject for many people. um it's a lot harder to process it because you feel more alienated, right? So I think if it was a common thing, it'd be easier. It's like when COVID was happening, like I think people were more open to talking about how like the pandemic was affecting them because everyone was going through it, right? It wasn't a private thing, like everyone was dealing with COVID. So, I think it brought a lot of openness to the conversation. So just how that just how that conversation started, I feel like we should be more open to talking about death. And as far as the future is concerned, yeah, I mean, I would like to think that eventually when I type in the human life cycle in Google Images, that I do see death there, right? And that that it's not shielded, that it's out there. um but also that people don't see it as such a dreadful thing, right? And of course, it is sad when you lose someone. I won't deny that, right? And um honestly, the people that come to our meetings, like whatever loss they had, like they will always remember that loss, but ideally they won't constantly be suffering from it, right? um the way of looking at it is like, when you're going through grief in the early stage, it's like an open wound, right? And eventually you get to a point where it's just a small scar, right? So, once a wound closes, it doesn't really hurt you, but it leaves a scar, which is a reminder, right? So we'll constantly have this reminder, but ideally we just get to a point where, we're a grief expert at our own loss, and we kind of learn how to cope with it, right? And in some cases, even learn something from it, right? And use it as and just remember that it's part of the life cycle, and it's an experience, right? Like losses are part of life, right? And it's something that that can be managed, right? And it's not something to be feared. So hopefully we'll get to a point where we're closer to that. And I think if we look back at history, um, there were some interesting trends that kind of went away. So actually, I went to this seminar some years back where this guy was talking about mourning jewelry, right? And there was this practice that at some point in history, people used to wear, jewelry to like not just at the moment of the funeral, but afterwards to show that they were mourning, right? And for some reason, this practice eventually went away, right? So I think at that point in history, um, people had a different relationship with loss and death, right? And maybe we'll see a comeback in these kinds of practices, right? To remind people that it does happen, and it's yes, it is unfortunate, but you know, um, it's just something that we all have to deal with, and that once we open up the discussion, I think we can all be more compassionate for each other. So when it is your turn to deal with it, you can just talk to anyone, right? And whereas right now it's like you really have to think about who you bring it up with, right? Because it's we're so shielded from it, right? And some people too, like they're scared, like you mentioned, like they're scared to talk about it, right? And they think that when you talk about death, like it's gonna cause their own death, right? It's not a disease or anything like that, right? It's just, something that happens, right? It's a necessity, right? It's like, it's like going to the bathroom, right? Like it's one of those things that we have to do as humans, right? And no one likes talking about that, but it happens, right? So just how we all have to, purge our waste out. We also have to at some point transition into something else, right? Whether it's nothingness or another soul or whatever you believe in, it's part of life. This transition.
Yeah, there's a quote from spiritual guru Ram Dass, who I bring up a lot on this podcast. And he says, "Death is perfectly safe. It's like taking off a tight shoe," which I think is a beautiful quote. And as we grow and as we age, death is something that is inevitable. We're going to have to deal with it in one shape or form, whether it be our own death or other people's death, which is why I think your work is so important. So, if people want to get into contact with you or if they want to attend a GriefX meeting, where can they find you?
Sure, yeah, they could find us online at griefx.com. So that is the word grief and then the letter X together.com. And then there's a link there for our online meetings, so they could click on there. Right now, at the moment, we're using Meetup to facilitate that. So if you don't live in one of the cities that's on there, just pick the city closest to you, or worst case, just choose the New York City one, and then you could join us online. So that's the best way to participate in the online meetings if anyone listening is going through that. And then we also have some general information on our website too, some resources to that might help you if there's something you're struggling with.
Fantastic. Well, Angel, thank you for all your work. Thank you for what you do, for what you're sharing with the world, and thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me on, Josh. It was a pleasure speaking with you.